Hello. Okay. Shall we close the door or? Is it? Yeah. Okay, great. Good afternoon, dear participants. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our first knowledge session here today during the South African Green Hydrogen Conference. It's also my pleasure to be your facilitator for this session. My name is Johannes Arndt. I'm an energy advisor at GIZ. I work for the project International PTX Hub. Discussions. We all delegation and delegations from some of our other partner countries to Copenhagen, where we visited MAN Energy Solutions. The MAN engines power about 50% of the global shipping freight. And they showed us one of the new green methanol dual fuel engines. And they also showed us the new engine that can run on green ammonia, and that will become operational and installed on ships from 2026. Another highlight was that we also participate in the inauguration of Maersk's world first green container vessel. Part of our delegation was also the MEC from the Northern Cape that you might have seen during the opening event today. And yeah, I can say the impression that we all had after the visit was that green shipping is not a theoretical idea anymore. From this year onwards, with the IMO goals and also with Maersk now having many ships in the order books, MAN reported that there are hundreds of the engines ordered to be installed in the ships, and over the coming years, it became obvious that all these ships, of course, require green fuels over the next years. And with that, I would, yeah, it's my pleasure to welcome our speakers here today and address this question to them. Is this a global trend now that is picking up? And what is South Africa's role participating in this development? What are the chances for South Africa and what are the opportunities? So first, I would like to welcome Rico Salkman. Rico is transport specialist at the Global Transport Unit of the World Bank, and Rico will provide us with an overview on the global trends of maritime transport and the opportunities that it will provide for green hydrogen. Yeah, welcome Rico, and I hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Johannes. I hope everybody can hear me well. Like you said, I think I need a pointer, don't I? Yeah, let me just... Okay, there we go. Fantastic. Well, I think first of all, we are quite fortunate that maritime, I think for the first time, as compared to the last summit, received a platform at the summit. I think maritime has not been recognized sufficiently much as a demand center for green hydrogen. Does that work better? Yeah. And we want to thank the GIZ for, first of all, organizing this knowledge session, but also the presidency for acknowledging that maritime has a role to play in the hydrogen economy. And now let's just quickly sort out the mic here. I think it's turned off now. Fantastic. And by setting the scene, is there someone from the PA who can help us? Yeah. It could be this one. Let's switch this off. I think that's much better. And for this, I want to zoom out onto the global shipping sector to set the scene a bit why maritime and green hydrogen is indivisible. Shipping accounts for 3% of global greenhouse gases. That's around 1 billion tons of carbon every year. At the same time, shipping, as we know, is critical for trade. We depend on shipping, developing countries, and that's specifically a World Bank perspective. Shipping contributes to sustainable development, prosperity of economies. So we have to find a way how we can continue doing shipping, enabling trade, but with less of a carbon footprint. And we're quite fortunate that in shipping we have a global regulator, which is the International Maritime Organization. That's a United Nations specialized agency setting safety standards, environmental standards, but of course also addressing the climate impact of shipping. And we just come back from 2 weeks of negotiations, early July. And Thomas was with us in London. The World Bank, we are an observer organization to the IMO as well. And South Africa is a critical country in those negotiations, represented by the Department of Transport and SAMSA. And they've done a tremendous job during these negotiations. So what has the IMO agreed last July? It increased shipping's reduction ambition in terms of GHG emissions from shipping. The 175 member states, and just remember 175 member states have to agree on one common thing. So it's a huge multilateral effort. What has happened last July have also agreed that shipping will be priced through an emissions pricing mechanism, global ship emissions. And lastly, we will develop a fuel standard for ships, meaning a certain fraction of energy consumed on board ships would need to come from zero or near zero emission sources. Now, how does that look in practice? By 2030, global shipping shall reduce its carbon footprint by 30%, by 2040 up to 80% in order to reach net zero emissions, and the language is by or around 2050. So these interim targets obviously set the pathway to zero, if you will. It leaves us around 3 decades, as we say here. But there's another target, which is, in our view, as far as hydrogen economy is concerned, even more interesting. And that is the 2030 fuel target. So governments agreed that by 2030, 5% of shipping's energy should come from zero or near zero emission fuels and technologies. So what does that mean? 5% by 2030. It means that by 2030, shipping must displace around 15 million tons of heavy fuel oil equivalents. So that is the fuel type shipping uses, heavy graded fuel oils, distillates, all fossil based, which in terms of energy content would, and that's obviously a hint, given that we are the Hydrogen Summit, would equal around 5 million tons of green hydrogen. Now, if we look at the energy modeling for shipping, and this is a synopsis of all the models carried out to describe shipping's decarbonization, done by the International Energy Agency, leading think tanks in shipping. We have a few centers sponsored by the Maersk Foundation, for instance, the class societies, which are sort of the expert organizations providing consulting services, but also statutory services to the shipping industry. Those models, on average, they summarize that by 2030, around 9 to 12% of ship fuels will be coming from a hydrogen source. And by 2050, that is 64%. The remainder being biofuels. And in what form will hydrogen come? Most likely in the form of e-ammonia as a carrier suitable to meet the demands of ship design and operational requirements. And at the World Bank, we looked into who can be the countries to produce those zero carbon fuels, which we talk about and which now the IMO has set targets on. And we did a global scoping exercise back in 2020, which already put South Africa on the list as a promising country, not only because of its renewable endowment, but of course also because it has a large coastline, it has a well-developed port system, it has ship traffic in its ports compared to many other countries, and obviously is located along major trade lanes. Now, as you see, this was in 2020, and one of the components of this analysis was the policy enabling environment. And I think we are at a different point now. We heard it this morning. We have the commercialization strategy for green hydrogen being now finalized. We have the society, the Hydrogen Society roadmap in between. And I think that puts South Africa really in the pole position to produce such fuels for the global shipping industry. Now, why are we why do we highlight the opportunities in maritime's decarbonization for hydrogen? Because, well, first of all, you can look at this from both sides. Which sector is enabling the other sector? And here we're talking about demand centers and who will offtake the product. And we heard this morning, we talk a lot about the supply side, which developers, which companies are looking into green hydrogen, but what we're often missing out is where does the demand come from? Yes, we talk about export markets and industries, but we want to highlight that shipping can be a critical demand source for green hydrogen. And I mentioned it earlier, by 2030 alone, based on the rules, which details will be spelled out, 5 million tons alone can be supplied or more to the shipping industry. Of course, from a maritime perspective, you say, what are the synergies? Well, in the first place, we can produce clean electricity feeding to the grid, clean, affordable electricity, green hydrogen for steel making or DRI making, fertilizers, and of course, transport fuels where electrification applications are not an option. Now, before I take too much time, I just want to sum it up. And this is something you should remember after the summit. And that's probably the only critical thing to remember in our view, coming from the shipping side. Shipping's decarbonization will depend on green hydrogen. And the hydrogen economy will depend on ports and shipping as a gateway, as a consumer, and as a carrier for this fuel. And with this, I hand back to Johannes, and we dig into the South African context. And the premier this morning, I think what he was mentioning for South Africa specifically, he said, look at the opportunities which we have in the specific opportunity. And I think the case of Bucho Bay and Saldanha being developed as future and current ports, they will bring all the synergies from local offtake through export markets, and I think that's what we want to signal here as well.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rico Salkmann. Thank you for providing us with an overview on the global trends in maritime transport. Now, as Rico said, we will look at the specific case here in South Africa, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to Gary Hopkins and Willem Sendebroek. Gary is senior engineer at the PRDW, which is the international consultancy that is specialized on port and coastal engineering. And Willem is a senior expert at MTBS, which is an international finance and business strategy consultant in port business solutions. Yeah, welcome to the stage, and yeah, looking forward to hear on those two specific cases and potentials.
Can I have the pointer as well? Thanks. Great, thanks Johannes for the warm welcome, and Rico, thanks for that great introduction. See some new faces, some familiar faces, that's great, welcome. Really looking forward to the next 15 minutes where myself and Willem are going to really just showcase our pre-feasibility study to produce green bunker fuels at 2 South African ports in South Africa. I'm just going to spend some time really just going through the who, what, where, when, how and why of the project, the technicalities, and then I'm going to hand over to my colleague Willem to unpack the financials and the business case a little bit. So I think we're all aware, and as Rico has really put forward well, is zero carbon fuels and zero carbon bunker fuels are really critical and have a lot of potential to assist in not only shipping's global decarbonization efforts, but also the world's global decarbonization efforts. And as such, for this study, our scope was to carry out a pre-feasibility study to assess the potential of pilot projects to produce zero carbon fuels and zero carbon bunker fuels at 2 South African port locations, one being the existing port of Saldanha Bay, and then the proposed port of Bucho Bay, both on the west coast of South Africa. In terms of fuels, we ended up focusing on green ammonia, green methanol, obviously a contender, but at Saldanha Bay there are some constraints with sustainable carbon sources. So for the rest of this presentation, we're really going to focus on Saldanha Bay, but Bucho Bay was dealt with in the study. So skipping a lot of work and a lot of steps, I have to unfortunately jump into our system summary. What did the system look like? You can see we have just under 1,650 megawatts of renewables, solar and wind, with some short transmission lines to an electrolyzer sitting inland co-located with the renewables. The electrolyzer has a capacity of 50,000 tons per annum of green hydrogen. which is fed by a desalination plant and storage on the Portland side by a pipeline just over 70 kilometers long. And then the electrolyzer is sending hydrogen back to the port at the ammonia synthesis plant. The hydrogen pipeline obviously acting as transport for hydrogen, but also as a storage and buffer mechanism. Then at the ammonia synthesis plant at the port, we have a capacity of 280 tons per annum of green ammonia, and that's serviced by a lithium-ion battery, 27 megawatts, and then, of course, the air separator to supply nitrogen to the Haber-Bosch process. Then also co-located with the ammonia synthesis, we have ammonia storage tanks, 45,000 cubic meters, and then just over a kilometer of loading infrastructure to the berth at Saldanha, where we have a bunker barge just under 9,200 cubic meters to either load bunkers to ocean-going vessels or to the port of Cape Town, which I'll touch on briefly. And then also on the port side, the marine side, we have the intake and outfall to the desalination plant. So how does the system look on a scaled layout? Just southeast of the town of Mariatsburg, we have our renewables, the wind and the solar, co-located with the electrolyzer. And that electrolyzer is serviced by the desal pipeline and the hydrogen pipeline, carrying hydrogen, or desalinated water and hydrogen to the electrolyzer respectively, along that 73-kilometer route. And then at the port of Saldanha Bay, to the west there, we have the ammonia synthesis and ammonia storage, also co-located with the desalination plant, intake outfall, the berth and the bunker barge. And then we also assume that that bunker barge will be able to service the localized demand at the port of Cape Town, which is 120 kilometers approximately south of the port of Saldanha. And then I'd just like to also draw your attention to that interesting graph in the top right of the slide. Our colleague Thomas Roos, this is just one of the many graphs that Thomas spent a lot of time and effort producing to essentially optimize the levelized cost of ammonia, the LCOA. And at this study, our LCOA ended up at just under €0.50 per kilogram of green ammonia, and that was at a split of 70% solar and 30% wind. And I would just like to draw some attention on some of the key aspects of both renewables and the port itself. Firstly, also our colleagues at the CSR did a nice negative mapping exercise to determine some potential preferred locations to site renewables. They really essentially a number of social environmental constraints, conservation planning, aquatic systems, also current and future land use, and then of course the renewable potential of the solar and the wind at the sites. And then moving on to, on the left-hand side, the Port Saldanha itself, in collaboration with Freeport Saldanha. We found a nice little pocket of land just on the northeast of the Freeport itself to site the ammonia, the synthesis and the storage. And then looking at the berths, the general maintenance quay to the west of the dry bulk terminal, the GMQ, we identified as a possible berth. It wouldn't be solely for export of green ammonia or bunkering, but it would be probably most likely common user facilities. We did also consider the liquid bulk berth on the southern end of the causeway, but unless we're exporting ammonia or hydrogen or methanol in large quantities, that probably won't be financially feasible. And one more aspect, I don't have it on the slide, but the when, we're assuming that construction of our facilities would commence in 2025. So just to touch on some of the technical conclusions before I hand over to Willem. Essentially, there is significant demand for zero-carbon fuels and bunker fuels at both the ports of Saldanha Bay and Boegoebaai. These fuels, like I said, can be used as bunkers to decarbonize the maritime industry and also to assist with global decarbonization efforts. We found that it is technically feasible to produce these fuels at both the two ports, but significant infrastructure is required, and there are going to be some technical challenges and risks. These could be mitigated as policy, regulations, and technology improve over the coming years. So we're waiting with bated breath to see how those improve. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Willem.
Yeah, thank you, Gary. I'll continue with the financial results of this pre-feasibility study. And I'd like to highlight that you do a lot of pre-feasibility studies as Port Consultant worldwide, but in this particular case we had a perfect team here in Saldanha and Boegoebaai, where we were supported by the GIZ funds as well. to understand the entire system. So we really deep dived into getting the location right, getting the sizes of wind and solar right, understanding the implication for the port, where it could be there. So I'd just like to highlight that this pre-feasibility study actually gives you a result which is much further enhanced than a pre-feasibility. And I think we can build on that as well to get it into a next stage. So to highlight the financials, energy transition and decarbonization doesn't come cheap. As you can see on this graphic, nearly 66% of the capex is in the renewables. We expect 1.3 billion US dollars actually on renewables. The next major items are the ammonia synthesizer and the electrolyzer of around 500 megawatt to produce, so 10% and 11%. So in all, the entire capex for this particular study would be 2 billion US dollars. So it's really a massive investment. And just to highlight that this massive investment has to come with policy to ensure this is going to be implemented. So 2 billion of investments for the entire chain. And I'd like to highlight that all the investments basically are looked into 2028 prices. So we look forward ahead when we go and construct all these elements. So if we then look at the financials in terms of business case, it's evident that you have to get revenues from your investment. So how have we structured this one? We basically made 4 scenarios where firstly we looked at the renewable scenario where you only make renewables through wind and solar and directly sell it off into the grid or to the industry, just to understand whether it's worthwhile to do this component of the study. Thereafter, we took it a further step. We creating the hydrogen. So we're creating the electrolyzer, and we're selling. We have the capability of selling hydrogen straight into the local industry. So nothing to do with bunkers yet. The third step is basically creating ammonia. So that's the third scenario, scenario C. There we take the hydrogen, convert it into ammonia with the ammonia synthesizer, and then we sell it either into the export market or we sell it to the industry, which can be a local again. And finally, we looked into the business case of providing bunkers. So we applied the same facilities, the same infrastructure to convert everything and selling it off to bunkers. And the bunkers were then defined as ammonia for ships, and we selected ammonia because of what we heard about man engines, for example. It's the slow stroke engine which needs to be converted for the long haul, and especially Saldanha with all its iron ore vessels, it's due there where ammonia engines may be applicable. So there the major demand is coming from, and the other top on demand is coming from Cape Town, where we have a number of container vessels obviously also to be supplied. So in a nutshell, this shows you the scenario, the 4 scenario results. And what we can see is that scenario A is pure the renewables. It's a viable scenario. It's a 242 million of MPV. However, and that's based on an electricity price. You sell the electricity off into the grid at the price of 0.045 US dollars per kilowatt hour. Then scenario B, creating hydrogen. That case, as we calculated, is not yet viable because we were calculating with a sales price of $2 per kilogram of hydrogen. And this is the offtake to local industry. But what we will see in the sensitivity analysis, that this project can become viable, but on these assumptions, on a WACC of 6.5%, it's giving a negative result. Scenario C, selling ammonia. There we looked at the ammonia price, which is currently running into the market. And if you apply this ammonia price, which is around the 780 US dollars per ton, then the business case is viable. So all the investments to create ammonia and to sell it at the ammonia price, which is currently already working in the market, then the project is directly viable. Now the last scenario, which is scenario D, is providing pure bunker fuels to ships. This project is not viable on the basis of our calculations, but that's because we took the energy value of ammonia versus the very low sulfur fuel oil, and ammonia has a much lower energy content, which means that the price to get the same energy content needs to be pretty low to compete with the very low sulfur fuel oil. So if you put the competition at the right level, it's not feasible. Then there are certain risks involved, and this table just shows you the main risks around the scenario of bunker fuels. And the main risk is around, let's say, the project scale. We have quite a substantial amount of investments to provide for a relatively small, let's say, offtake in the bunkers. Then we're talking about nascent technology, so there's still a lot to learn to implement it. But I think the highest risk of the business case is around the off-takers. So if we are capable of getting the off-takers at a reasonable price, then suddenly your business case will work. And the sensitivity analysis will show this. And finally, financial risks. Again, we're talking about a very new industry. It will come at a cost. So it will come at financial support. It has to come at financial support. And this requires political support and, let's say, pure financial climate funds, for example, to support these type of investments. Then to come to the sensitivity analysis. Quite a table with a lot of numbers, but I'll talk you through very quickly. Basically, you see here the four scenarios, A, B, C, D, against an expected WACC, a weighted average cost of capital, versus a capex subsidy. So what it shows you is that a project become feasible at these numbers. And scenario A, which is the renewables, it's in the blue bars, is everywhere financially viable. Simply because we're selling straight into the grid and we're not investing too much into electrolyzer and the ammonia synthesizer. Scenario B, which is creating the hydrogen, that becomes feasible at the WACC of 6% and a subsidy onto capex of 40%. So that's near to the $2 per kilogram. It also becomes feasible here at the 4% versus a capex of 20%. So there are, let's say, balance. It's a balance between subsidy on capex and a balance on, let's say, the financial reward you'd like to have through the weighted cost of capital. Scenario C, which is creating the ammonia, that becomes viable at the WACC of 10% and the capex subsidy of 30%, or no capex support, and then you can realize a WACC of 6%. And then finally, the the case on bunker fuels, that one across this matrix doesn't come viable, and it simply means that the equation to get the bunker fuels at the same level of the VLSO price is very difficult. So there you have to see different measurements which are coming outside, basically on top over the maritime industry, which, for example, the IMO carbon tax may contribute to close that gap. So in all, we basically see with these pre-feasibility studies that it is viable to go ahead in Saldanha Bay and Buchan Bay, especially for the ammonia case. And in terms of the maritime bunker market, it really deserves special attention. It will help in de-risking the investment because you have demand on it. And once you have created the supply of ammonia, you can also sell it to bunkers later on. But as a pure, let's say, measurement, it's difficult. IMO has to come with new regulation. They're working on it. So basically, we will say on the supply side, we need to have subsidy support, cheap finance, and on the demand side, regulation, shall support to get these type of projects implemented.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gary and Willem, for showing us some details of the zero carbon bunker fuel study, looking at 2 specific ports here in South Africa. Next, we will be looking into some potential optimizations, and we will also hear on some initiatives and South Africa's potential to move forward in green shipping. I think it is worth to underline that talking about hydrogen here during the conference, it will not go without shipping, and transporting the hydrogen, or in whichever form it will be exported. It will also be very viable to offer green transportation in order to meet the needs of off-takers. So with that, it's a great pleasure to introduce you to Thomas Roos. It's a very great pleasure because Thomas is also with the CSIR part of our International PTX Hub project. Thomas and his team is also supporting us on various studies. For example, we are looking at not zero carbon bunker fuels. We are looking at the availability of carbon for the production of PTX products here in South Africa. We have one of our consultants from Exergia here who's doing that study. We are also supported by the CSIR in one study together with Fraunhofer, where we look into the potential allocation studies where at least cost PTX products can be used in the energy mix in South Africa, looking until 2030, 40 and 50. So with that, yeah, it's a great pleasure to have you here, Thomas, and to hear from you. Yeah.
Okay, you've got a little goodie there. Thank you so much. There's a temptation to think that you've done an analysis, now you understand. Insight has dawned, truth has been found, we can all move forward. Unfortunately, insight is progressive, and hindsight, as they say, is an exact science. So as we go on with this, you keep on finding some irritating things. So let's just go through a quick kickoff. We decided to move my presentation towards the end for reasons which will become clear, but some of the early slides presumed that we would be presenting earlier, so I just want to nail a few things down. We are saying, as South Africans, that as a result of our solar and wind resource, then we compete very well with other coastal countries in the cost at which we can produce green hydrogen. That presumes that transport costs are not significant. Of course, that's not always true, and that takes us to an analysis of what the market looks like. Often, the hydrogen market is presented to you as a monolith, that it pre-exists, and it's there, and it's just begging you to exploit it, and we're all going to make millions, and happiness forever after. I'd like to suggest that's not quite true. And we, in actual fact, in South Africa, don't have one market, but three, and they're very different in their nature. The export market is what you hear most about, driven by initially the Far East with Japan, and then more recently, since 2019, 2020, the European Green Deal, the European Green Hydrogen Strategy, the German National Hydrogen Strategy, and how we can position for that is we can export our green hydrogen as a longer molecule, being green ammonia. Does this actual... Can you see a green dot there? Oh, okay, I didn't think so. So you can export it as ammonia, and there are at least 4 ports that are lining up for that at the moment. Or you could export it as direct reduced iron, and ArcelorMittal is busy looking at that. So far so good. The downside of this option is that you are competing in dollar-denominated terms delivered in the port of Rotterdam or in Hamburg or in Kobe, Japan, or wherever. So if your competitor is a lot closer to that port, that leaves you in a difficult position. Your second market is your local market. You hear a lot about the local market as well, typically in international literature saying how necessary it is for decarbonization, and it is necessary. I'm not pushing back against that. But that presumes that our market is ready to absorb this particular commodity, and it has a willingness to pay. And both those assumptions have got a few issues. So in your local market, you're going to struggle to get the same scale as your export market. And without scale, you can't drive the costs down, which means your costs are more expensive, so it becomes more difficult to reach your second thing, your customer. How do you get your customer? And who is your customer locally? So we can suggest that who is going to be prepared to pay the premium? We can say the mines will be prepared to pay the premium. Why? Well, because the mines have a rather existential crisis. They've got to reduce their Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions. And pretty much all their emissions are coming from the combustion of diesel, but not all their operation costs come from diesel. So if you treble your fuel costs, it doesn't cripple their operations. That's not true for another operation, which might be, say, logistics companies. You double your fuel cost, you've destroyed the business case right there because they operate in fairly thin margins. So your local market is looking a bit dodgy, right? It's not that strong. And your overseas market implies that you can do end-to-end and you can deliver and you can do it competitive. Fortunately, it doesn't stop there. There is a third market, which I call the border market. The border market is not where you take your product to the customer, but where the customer comes to you. And this is where maritime shipping fits in. So it's where a vessel comes at your port to refuel, or where an aircraft lands at your airport to refuel. Now for aviation, synthetic kerosene is the only option, and that's with Fischer-Tropsch, and there's going to be a session on that a little bit later, and obviously PetroSA and Sasol are well positioned towards that. In terms of shipping, you've heard that there is this new market. As a result, very, very recently, in climate terms, being July this past year, when the IMO committed to a net zero future. And the net zero future is great. That's way out here in 2050. But far more important is the 2030 target. The 2030 target means 5% of energy in vessels need to be from a green source, with an aspirational goal of 10%. Now, IMO regulations do not bind corporations. They bind member states, which means member states need to make this fuel available. There is the market. There wasn't a market, now there is. This is a good thing. What does this mean? It's potentially very large volumes. If we look at the shipping volumes that already call at Saldanha Bay and Cape Town, and if you were to convert the entire hydrocarbon fuel towards an ammonia equivalent, you have a hydrogen demand shared between those two ports of 504 kilotons per year. That is 2/3 more than Japan planned to import from 2030 as a nation. That's a big market. If we look at the slightly easter ports of further east, I should say, Port Elizabeth and Kucha, it's roughly half that, 247 kilotons per year. That's still a sizable market, and that's fairly attractive. So the fuels, as mentioned, is going to be ammonia and methanol for future. But for the existing fleets, it's going to be hydrocarbons, and Fischer-Tropsch looks interesting there. What's exciting is that at least for Saldanha Bay, there are plans for a green corridor, and you're welcome to chat to Vanessa about that. So, in that context, you've seen this slide. You've seen this discussion about what it is going to do. We're going to be looking at green ammonia, what cost can it be produced, and how can they be financed. I'm not going to discuss finance. That's going to be done, that's been done by Willem already. The tricky thing, just when you think you've nailed it down, insight, as I say, is progressive. And there are some problems that came about as a result of further insight. I don't know how much you know about ammonia. I certainly didn't know that much about ammonia when I began. But essentially what happens is you get your green hydrogen, you electrolyze water, you get your ammonia. You get your nitrogen from separating it from air. Compress them together, put it through a synthesis bed, and you're going to make ammonia. Happiness. Unfortunately, that's not quite the picture. Only between 25 and 35% actually becomes ammonia. The other gas doesn't react, and it comes in a return loop. Now, if you keep doing this, you keep pumping more gas in and more goes round and round, you end up with a buildup of incandescible gases, particularly argon. This requires purging. So you're going to have a purge coming out over here. But if you're only reacting 25% of your total amount and you are purging a small amount, like 2.5% of your bypass stream, but your bypass stream is twice or more your input stream, it means you're purging 6%. If you're purging 6% your input stream, you've got to increase the size of your air separation unit, you've got to increase the size of your electrolyzer plant. Okay, so far so good. But it doesn't quite stop there. A Haber-Bosch reactor can make ammonia, but this is not an economically ideal system. It is a real-world engineering system. It can cycle. It can go down to 33%. It doesn't like going below that, otherwise it wants to switch off. And the problem with switching off is that the catalyst bed gets cold. Bed gets cold, it degrades, which means you've got to replace it. Okay, that's not the end of the world. We've been making ammonia for 100 years, can't be a problem. Problem is, the standard way of making ammonia around the world is electricity coming from the grid, which runs 24/7. But renewables doesn't do that. It is intermittent by nature, which now means you've got a rock and a hard place. You've got an irresistible force and an immovable object. This doesn't want to go anywhere, and the renewables doesn't want to stop. So you've got to compensate for that by extra hydrogen storage, and we're using the pipeline to do that, and a battery to have the extra electricity. Now, how do you do that? So you want, when you've got excess electricity, you want to make extra hydrogen, which means that your electrolyzer must be bigger than what the ammonia plant wants. It also means that your renewables needs to be bigger than the electrolyzer because you need extra electricity to charge, one, and two, the renewables isn't always available, so that's another reason why that's extra. Cool. You've got extra heat. This is a good thing that you're going to throw away. You can make a steam turbine. You can make extra electricity. Happiness. But that extra electricity is only enough to drive this compression. It's not enough to drive your air separation unit, certainly not enough to do your electrolysis. So now you're managing all these variables. So, what does this mean? We've stripped out a whole lot of slides, so for your happiness, because that would have been quite a lot for you to go through. But what we can conclude is that if your system is grid connected rather than island, you can be between 7 and 9% cheaper. The reason for that is, remember I said we're going to oversize our renewables. If you have an islanded grid, which doesn't talk to the connected grid, DMRE likes that, it's nice and simple. The certification requirements in Europe like it because you know that it's green. But we have excess electricity, it's curtailed, it has no value to you. If you have a connected grid on the other hand, you can sell that extra electricity, and because you're amortizing the cost of your renewable infrastructure over the sale of those electrons, it means that your net costs come down, which is a good thing. Your level of oversizing is significant to do what? to make sure you get good capacity factor. Remember, you don't want your ammonia plant to shut down. Now, the problem here is increasing capacity factor and decreasing cost are mutually exclusive. You either have good capacity factor or you have good cost. That's not a happy narrative. So that's something that we have to manage. And so in the previous analysis, we were looking at a 27 megawatt battery. We got a lot more ambitious, went to 120 and 500. You can see that by moving from 120 to 500, we increase cost by between a third to a half, and we increase capacity factor by 1 point. Not a very good investment case. But on the other hand, if we move from, at a particular point, from the highest capacity factor point to, from the lowest cost at a particular capacity factor to the highest capacity factor point for that particular region, we start ending up with a cost gain approximately double what your capacity factor gain is. So we've not nailed this down yet. We are closer. We would like to be able to give you a happy answer. We are not quite there yet. And so this is our current lowest cost option, but as I say, it is a moving target. And that's what I have to say for now.
Thank you very much, Thomas Roos. Are there any questions? Yes, please. I come over and hand you the microphone. Please introduce yourself with your name and organization, and then.
Thank you very much to all the panelists. It's Nico Fischer from the University of Cape Town Catalysis Institute. Thank you very much for the introduction to catalysis and the ammonia synthesis. Indeed, it is complicated. From a pure process aspect, I always wonder, ammonia for shipping industry. The ammonia market globally is immense. It's one of the biggest chemicals produced globally. Is it, if instead of waiting for MAN and the shipping companies to build the new, more expensive engines into their ships, how much time will this take? And is it not more sensible to use the green ammonia to replace the fossil-based ammonia on global markets, and maybe have an access there on some countries might pay a margin, go through being green in the feedstock and stuff like that?
Do you want to take a few questions, or you want to do one by one? How do you want to do it?
I think we can add one and then, yeah. Okay, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you so much. My name is Dionys Oakeye. I am senior consultant from GFA Consulting Group in Hamburg. So my question is about the financing. You say that ammonia is not competitive compared to the heavy fuel oil, and even if we get capex support, that it's not competitive. And did you look into the contribution of CO2 tax, and maybe what will be the level of tax on CO2 in order to make it competitive? Thanks.
Thank you very much. I saw one question directed into this direction and then the other one over there, so I'll start with you.
There's two questions and two answers. 100%. What we are looking at in this study predates the IMO decision by pretty much 6 months. So when this was happening, sustainable maritime shipping was a concept. Technically possible, but almost no imaginable way of how it could be financed. The two fuels that were in contention were ammonia and methanol. There was only so much budget and there was a defined amount of time. And the idea being that you can make ammonia pretty much anywhere, you can only make methanol where you've got carbon, and then you need to argue about whether the carbon is sufficiently, who is the gatekeeper on the source of the carbon. If it's for the EU, then it's particularly anal. If it's for IMO, that haven't yet made a decision, and that could be difficult. And so we went round and round, so we came up with ammonia because that was an easier argument to make. 100% as a cargo, quite right. The issue here was to say, what would it take to produce sustainable shipping? So what costs are you looking at? What would the demand be? Because we didn't know at that point. We knew what it would take if you took the South African shipping and replaced it but how likely is that? And that's where Willem comes in when he said, okay, look, we were looking at 50 kilotons per year of hydrogen for 280 kilotons per year of ammonia, and he can talk you through how he got to those particular points. But it was a marine-specific study. Ammonia may not have been the best choice, especially seeing the fact that now we have got IMO regulations that support methanol, and we have methanol engines that are available now. Neither of those things are true for ammonia, but they are coming. And the idea being that if you're going to be doing catalysis, if you're going to be doing ammonia or methanol, they are sort of analogous. They are different, yes, but you need an extra gas stream, you need a catalyst bed, you need some or other magic process to go and produce a liquid product, and so on. So we then analyze the one, hoping to understand the complexity of both. I hope that answers that question reasonably.
If I may, I want to add a point, because you were asking why don't we target first the green fertilizer market. I mean, shipping, we have to understand, it's a globally regulated industry. So it's not us suggesting that it would be good to produce a renewable shipping fuel, but it is shipping as a demand center which will come regardless. So although it may be a good idea to produce green fertilizers too, the rules for shipping will be set, and they're coming. So meaning if ships require, and this is what Thomas referred to and I did in the very first place, to use a green fuel, that demand will inevitably come. And there's one more aspect to it, because we talk about cost. Who would be willing to pay for an extra expensive green fertilizer, which would make food production more expensive? That's a difficult case to sell, especially in least developed countries, right? How can we say you need to make your fertilizer input, as an input to the food industry, agriculture green, and pay a premium to it? Now, a country deciding to make fertilizers green, that will maybe feed into their NDCs, their nationally determined contributions, and whether they meet it or not. But shipping is globally regulated and member states will enforce it. This is what has happened with any regulation in shipping. Safety standards, the low sulfur regulations came into effect in 2020. And for those who watch the shipping space, fuels were bought at a premium because it was required to do so. And I mentioned the green fuel standard. So that green fuel standard, the best value sort of for us to kick off that transition is in that green fuel standard, because it means you have to use these fuels, and then cost all of a sudden doesn't play a big role. We talked about what is the price differential between conventional fuels, very low sulfur fuel oils, which are trading 400 tons $1, I guess, at the moment. So does anybody want to pay a premium? No, of course not. But when we have to use these fuels, I have to pay for it regardless. And that's what we've seen in the past, and that's what's going to happen. And that's the beauty about the shipping market, because we don't have to convince anyone to pay a premium for a green fuel. But if they have to, there's no way around. And for shipping, I mean, for those outside the shipping market, it may sound a bit abstract how we can, because also you made that link between its countries. Yes, it's countries getting together at the IMO, making these rules. But shipping is a business and industry which is also enforceable globally through mechanisms for the shipping professionals, port state control, flag state control, and there's effective mechanisms which can avoid loopholes. And ultimately, we have a few nations which registering ships. We have a lot of nations where ships call, meaning coastal states, port states, with that sort of enforcement duty. So that is nothing we make up or we suggest that would be good to decarbonize shipping, but it's an enforceable rule which ultimately will require the ships and even to buy these fuels at a premium. And that's why shipping is so interesting. We don't have to convince anybody of that.
Yeah, and if I may add, the beauty of the study tours that we are doing sometimes is that it also illustrates really what is behind the meaning of these words. And what Maersk, for example, showed us is we're talking a lot about premiums. What does it actually mean? They calculated what it costs to, what premium will be there if, for example, sneakers are transported with green fuels from China to Europe. And that means it comes down to 30 euro cents per sneaker if they are transported by green fuels. So I think that is not a lot. It can make a difference when it comes to food production, when those products increase by certain percentages. But if it comes down to premium products, I think that is not a big difference. but I would also like to give Willem the chance to respond.
Yeah, I'd like to respond first of all on the ammonia. Around 90 million tons of ammonia is globally used in refineries and fertilizer processes. So there's definitely a market out there as a commodity. And I'd like to hook on to what Rico is saying is the shipping industry will be regulated, and this is already happening, and targets are being set. So what's happening to the shipping industry is that they have to convert. Now a ship goes, let's say 25 years, 30 years in economic lifetime. So what we have to look at is to change, and that's done through regulation, that new built ship have to have these new alternative fuels. So this is where methanol comes into place, and ammonia will come in very near future. And then we have a demand as ships will come to South Africa for loading your minerals, for bringing consumable goods. So this is definitely a demand market which is on top. And then we have to, well, we're basically not too much worried about the cost of providing those bunker fuels. It's more that we need to be there ready when those ships are being deployed. Otherwise, let's say those ships will not come here. So this is again where South Africa can let's say jump the league as being first mover by providing this kind of system and providing these new alternative fuels. This will enhance ship owners to build ships and replace ships, especially for these type of shipping markets. Now about the carbon tax. The carbon tax obviously is also something which will come. I mean, in Europe, in the car industry, you already have taxes on fuels. But the shipping industry will also have this. And if you transfer the current carbon tax levels, then it's just very marginal. So there's no, the steps will be made, and the comparison will be, let's say, closer, but still you cannot compare, let's say, the energy value of ammonia with very low sulfur fuel oil. But hopefully in the future we don't have to. This is basically the message.
Yeah, I see many more hands and yeah, possible questions. We came already to the end of the session, but I would suggest to have maybe some discussions outside afterwards. I have some closing remarks. If I would allow it you, then I would also need No, I think we can have some discussions afterwards. There will be a break now, and yeah, I think
it's a very detailed answer to this question, and in the IMO process currently, that impact assessment you talk about, what are the impacts on trade if we employ new technology which is inherently more expensive, right? In that case, fuels. And there's a very comprehensive process which now recently got kicked off in September. That's called the Comprehensive Impact Assessment, and that goes along with the development of those rules. But I think, again, South Africa's advantage is that it will be a beneficiary of that energy transition if it's able to produce and supply these fuels. And that's a much bigger market than the impact on trade in terms of costs. That's what indicatively studies already confirm. But we can have that discussion separately because it's a relevant one. And one last point, the South African authorities, SAMSA and DOT, you guys represent this country in the IMO. And we recognized several times now how important those IMO rules are to unlock hydrogen as a market. So there rests a very specific responsibility also on those departments, Department of Transport and SAMSA as its agency in the IMO, to advocate for policies which enable this hydrogen economy, because shipping can do that. And so I'm just flagging this. This is an important piece of work for South Africa. And the South African delegation, by the way, did a great job in forging this deal. Now let's spell out the details and make sure hydrogen is going as part of it.
And to add, GIZ is also committed to look into that topic further. We have workshops coming up and studies planned where we look into specific topics and implications and opportunities that topic has. With that, I would like to thank our speakers, and yeah, please come together for being here with us today and sharing your work. Thank you very much. I would also like to add, there is this Green Hydrogen South Africa LinkedIn group. I think there are already 800 people in the group. There are more than 800 people at the conference, so that means some might not be part of that group already, and there were more people who wanted to come and could not come. So you can scan the barcode and join that group. It's a closed group and allows exchange, and we were also publishing activities in that specific topic and field. And you're also invited to follow the International PTX Hub on LinkedIn to learn about what we are doing also in our other partner countries. With that, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your attention. And if someone feels like having a German beer, I have some invitation cards for the German pavilion to join our Special Envoy for Green Hydrogen, Dr. Jürgen Friedrich, later today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our Knowledge Bits and Practice Tools session for the afternoon. Today we will be taking a deep dive into green hydrogen export potential of South Africa, presented by Louw-Anita Snyman van der Walt from CSIR, and then we will be looking at the carbon sources availability and utilization in South Africa, presented by George Leotakis. Yes, he is from Exergia. I am Medina Willis. I am an advisor for the International PTX Hub at GIZ, and I will be the moderator for this session. So just quickly to run you over things, GIZ has 2 projects focusing on green hydrogen. The first is H2SA, and the second is the International PTX Hub. I will be handing over to Louw-Anita and George shortly, but just to quickly go over the agenda, we will start with a presentation from Louw-Anita, open up the floor for questions and answers, then go to the presentation from George, and then open up the floor for the second time for questions and answers. Please feel free to raise your hand at any point during the question and answers, and a mic will be given to you to answer any questions that you may have. And when introducing yourself, maybe you can just give a brief description, name, and who you're asking the question to if it's at the end of the session and you have any last thoughts that you want to bring up. Great. Our first speaker is Louw-Anita Snyman van der Walt. She is an environmental and geospatial scientist at the CSIR. Louw-Anita holds an MSc in environmental science and an MSc in geographic information science. She has 10 years experience in strategic environmental assessment, management, and planning with a focus on spatial analysis, geodesign, and systems thinking for environmental assessment and responsible decision making on sustainability transitions. I will hand over to Louw-Anita to do a presentation on green hydrogen export potential in South Africa, a spatial atlas.
Thanks, Medina. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you are still fresh ahead of this final session of day 2 of the summit. I'm going to tell you a little bit about a project that we've been doing with our partner GFA Consulting for the H2SA program on green hydrogen and PTX opportunities for South Africa. I'll specifically be presenting on the export potential atlas that we've been working on for the past couple of months. I'll just give you a quick overview of the what we call the Lighthouse project, because it's quite a mouthful, the H2PTX market opportunities for South Africa, analyses of Lighthouse projects and environmental social impact assessment, Lighthouse project in short, and just the Green Hydrogen Atlas work that we've been doing, including looking at the approach that we used to develop the atlas, what were the criteria that we considered, how were those classified and scored and weighted. I'll show you the results and then we'll move on to the next steps. So this is the Lighthouse project in a nutshell. It's being conducted under the H2SA program, and we are looking at a range of different activities, ultimately to improve conditions for companies to participate in the South African green hydrogen economy and to improve relevant stakeholders' knowledge of the potential environmental and social impacts of a hydrogen economy. So a lot of it is focused on techno-economic aspects, but a lot of it is also focused on environmental and social aspects. And just to highlight that we are looking at the first work package, output, the Green Hydrogen Potentials Atlas. So the terms of reference for this specific activity was to identify and present suitable sites or regions in South Africa for the production of green hydrogen and its derivatives, taking into account the options of exportation and local use. And so we've done a geographic information systems analysis. This is obviously a crucial tool for sustainable infrastructure planning and has been used globally for planning for renewable energy, as well as some examples for green hydrogen production. Essentially, we consider spatially explicit key siting variables that constitute either push or pull factors, considering specifically environmental conditions and sensitivities, the uses and users of the various environments, and the requirements to produce green hydrogen and PTX products. So initially, we envisaged developing a single integrated atlas, but it soon became clear that we had to disaggregate these export and local use aspects. Firstly, they are different in their requirements and ultimately how they might roll out. So the export projects are probably ultra projects, big off-takers overseas. They'll be probably located or focused around our export ports, and the co-location of renewable energy, green hydrogen production, and the off-taker is rather unlikely for the gigawatts and gigawatts needed. You'd probably be moving electrons. While the local market is probably anticipated to be smaller scale projects and off-takers, probably more decentralized across various industries in South Africa, ranging from chemicals, fertilizer, mobility, steel and cement. So our local decarbonisation ambitions are at the forefront. And since these are likely more smaller, we can expect that co-location is more likely. So ultimately, we considered 6 key criteria. The first one being proximity to end users and off-takers, which in this case was Saldanha Bay, Kucha, Richards Bay, and the proposed Boegoebaai port. Secondly, of course, looking at resource availability, the inputs that we need to produce green hydrogen, so solar, wind, and desalinated seawater. We looked at existing infrastructure, so proximity to road, rail, and electricity grid. An important assumption in this regard is that we assume that grid is available. So at this stage, we aren't factoring in any grid capacity constraints. Then we also looked at political will and strategy, so looking at where government has prioritized the rollout of electricity and renewable energy projects. These are specifically the renewable energy development zones and the electricity grid infrastructure corridors, where you enjoy a bit more of a streamlined environmental authorization process. And by virtue, the SEZs and IDZs associated with our 4 focus ports. Then moving on to land use and safety, looking at potential conflicts, which would be push factors, or synergies that would be pull factors. Agriculture would be a push factor, for example, whereas residential or highly populated areas might be a push factor. Then finally, looking at environmental features, so the critical environmental features that we want to safeguard, and these included protected and conservation areas, watercourses, critical biodiversity areas, and steep slopes, amongst others. We then went about classifying these different criteria. Just 2 examples to show you here. For example, proximity to grid, 50 kilometers, 50 to 200, beyond 200 kilometers, and each one of those would then be scored as being either restricted or optimal. In the case of the grid, for example, closer than 50 kilometers would be optimal, and farther than 200 kilometers would probably score like a 2 or a 1, so less suitable. And ultimately, we also ranked the different criteria. We gave them a relative importance score. So proximity to grid might be less important than good renewable energy resource, as an example. And we did the classification, scoring, and ranking with inputs from our working group, which consists of various technical and environmental stakeholders. So this is probably a bit small, but maybe just to give you a full picture, and the colors are really weird. They're a bit blue. Never mind. Just to give you a full picture of all the criteria that we considered, how they were ranked in terms of their relative importance, the individual features that we looked at, and then the classes and the associated values. Ultimately, About 56% constituted pull factors, so what is the best conditions to develop hydrogen projects, and about 44% constituted push factors. So where are you less likely to want to locate your project? And this is the result. You'll notice it looks slightly different from some of the pictures that you saw this morning from Minister Ramakgopa. It differs from some of the other green hydrogen atlases that you might have seen on the market. And essentially, we believe that this paints a more realistic picture in terms of land availability, especially because we are considering those environmental safeguards that we would rather avoid when proposing our projects. You'll see that the areas around the ports obviously came out quite strongly because this was a very important criteria. But we can also see some very prominent constraints around each of these, especially as you move into the Eastern Cape, the KwaZulu-Natal province, excuse me, mainly because of agricultural activities and population density. So it's important to note that this map doesn't present go or no-go. It is just a first pass indication to inform developers and other stakeholders where you might want to look when you are proposing your project, and then also what to look out for. We are in the process of turning this into an online spatial atlas where you'll be able to switch layers on and off and also query the data so you can understand the underlying variables that are driving these scores. So you might click on a grey area and you'll understand that, oh, this is in a national park, but it's actually got really good renewable resource, or it's still too far away from a road. Ultimately, you can use this tool as a first pass to identify potential sites to drill deeper before you make your development decisions. So this is still in progress, and we hope to finalize that in the coming few weeks. So what are our next steps? As I mentioned, we are busy developing the queryable web map so that you can understand what's driving the rankings and the scores that were assigned to specific areas. We're going to be writing up the method and providing some user guidance so that the users can understand the underlying assumptions and not use the tool in an incorrect or inappropriate way when making their first pass citing decisions. And then finally, we'll also be doing a similar exercise for the local use market. And here, the off-takers would be local industry, and our water sources would not be limited to seawater desalination only, but also consider other potential sources of water. And we believe that this will highlight some of the inland opportunities for green hydrogen production. And with that, I thank you.
No. Oh. Thank you so much, Luanita. We will now open up the floor for any questions anybody may have.
I did a good job then.
Okay, so perhaps I can ask you the first. Oh, great.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dinga Sikwebu. I work for a foundation called Heinrich Bull Foundation, and I work with a civil society network called Hydrogen Watch. And Luanita, I've just small questions. If I understood you properly, you dealt with the export market, and you were also going to look at the local market. I just wanted to know when the local market is going to be done. And you said the export one will be done in few weeks. I just wanted to know what's few weeks. Just in that, yeah.
You sound a bit like the client. So essentially the deadline for this project is April next year. And so that's our ultimate goal that we're working towards. We were hoping to launch the online tool here today, but unfortunately there were still a few bugs to figure out. So hopefully by November we have the export atlas going, and by April next year the domestic one as well.
Hello, I'm Jeannie Pistorius van Eskom. I just would like to ask you, would you ever consider doing LCOH with incorporated in your model to see how economically feasible these projects will be across South Africa? Thank you.
Thanks for that question. Yeah, so a lot of the other models out there are quite heavily focused on the techno-economics, and they delve into what the LCOH and the LCOE ultimately is. For this study, we've taken a bit more of a balanced view, but within the other work packages, we are calculating LCOE and LCOH for several reference sites across South Africa, and we'll be plugging that into the map as well, so you can click on it and get a sense of what the LCOE or H is likely to be for that particular point.
Are there any more questions, thoughts? Okay, perhaps I can ask you a question, Luanita. What makes this South African Green Hydrogen Potential Atlas different from other green hydrogen atlases that have been developed, i.e. Fraunhofer, etc.?
Yeah, so most of these models and tools have taken into consideration a range of criteria from techno-economic, environmental, social, much like we have done. But there are a few key main differences. So the Fraunhofer one is at a kind of a national scale, comparing countries with each other, whereas the H2 Africa one that's been piloted for a few West African countries is at catchment scale, and it also showcases more of the LCOE and H perspective. When you query their data, it does give you some information on other aspects like what the groundwater constraints might be or what the socio-political constraints might be, but it doesn't really visually display these like ours does in terms of showing those environmental safeguards. So quite a few similarities, but also different. This is a tool that's suited to South Africans focusing more finer scale.
Okay, great. Last call for questions to Luanita. Maybe I can just wrap up with one last question. In terms of the future outlook, are there any planned developments or improvements for the Atlas? Obviously, this would be focused on improving its accuracy and usefulness along the line.
Yes, so with these types of things, you're always constrained by the quality of the data that you use as input. And of course, in 5 or 10 years' time, the data we used might be outdated. So there probably needs to be some form of mechanism to ensure that we keep it updated. I do not know whether there's a project mechanism to keep that going, but ultimately it will be very clear in terms of what data was used, when it was applicable, and you'll be able to see the criteria that we use, so you'll be able to recreate the results ultimately if we are not able to keep it updated for the next 50 plus years.
Okay.
Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Luanita. And now we will hear from George, focusing on carbon sources availability and utilization in South Africa. George is the head of Unit on Energy Policy and Planning at Exergia. Dr. George Fueliotakis is a mechanical engineer and holds a PhD in combustion modeling and an MSc in energy production and management, both from the National Technical University of Athens, Greece. George is, like I said earlier, the head of the Energy Policy and Planning Unit at Exergia. Exergia is also one of the International PTX Hub's implementation partners, and George will now tell us about carbon sources availability and utilization in South Africa.
Thank you, Medina. So, good evening also from my side. As Medina said, I'm George, so I will guide you through the work that we have done to identify the carbon source availability and utilization in South Africa, focusing mainly on a demand and supply analysis. So we have to speak to introduce the concept of the work. We are going to set the scene, we'll see the approach and the methodology that we have followed, and we'll see the analysis on the carbon supply and demand, and we're going to conclude with some key takeaways, and possibly we can discuss about the next steps. First of all, just to put everything into context, this work, as Medina said, has been in the frame of the activities of the Power2X Hub, the International Power2X Hub, and it was a project having to do with the carbon sources, and we are implementing carbon sources for the production of Power2X products to cover also export demands for South Africa. So Exergia has been the implementing party of this project, and we have experience in energy policy consulting. We are working worldwide, but I have to say as a disclaimer that whatever is presented here is still an ongoing work. It will be finalized very soon, and then it will be up to GIZ and the P2X Hub how to publicize it. Okay, so we do know, and even we had the conference, the recent conference on the NDCs, we can see that carbon is getting into the focus for the decarbonization of the world. So we have the solutions that target the CO2 reduction, either it's CCU, CCS, or carbon removal, or whatever it is. So you have a strong focus coming from the high-level policy documents. Then we are in a position where we have studied enough the decarbonization ways. So, and in this study, we've seen that the Power2X becomes central in the decarbonization road. So this gives a boost to carbon as a source to be utilized afterwards as an energy carrier. And we are in a good position to be able to have Power2X being a very versatile product. So because we have a lot of products, Power2X products, that can go to all end-use sectors, and they can cover a lot, both local demand and exports. Now, what was the objective of the work? Is to investigate South Africa's potential to produce Power2X products and to export them to Europe or to other international markets, but without jeopardizing the security of supply within the country, okay? And what's the context? We know that South Africa is characterized by relatively high carbon intensity power and industrial sectors. There are a lot of possibilities to exploit and utilize CO2 emissions. However, the country at the moment lacks a unifying theme on CCU and CCS. And at the same time, there lacks also an umbrella framework for Power2X products. And what we did to overcome these lacks that we had in the analysis, we tried to estimate first of all, how much carbon could be available for the most suitable point sources in South Africa. Then to see how this could evolve into the future, to understand the demand, the local demands, and then through the construction of some scenarios that to us are plausible, but by no means are exhaustive, to understand the dynamics, to see how the supply and demand for carbon will look like into the future and investigate what would be essentially the potential for exports. So the focus is synthetic fuels at the end. And we have to look at the framework conditions. First, we have South Africa. This is local demand. Then we have international markets. This mainly comes from Europe, where there is the RED II and RED III strategies. And also we have the IMO and the ICAO, the International Aviation and Maritime Markets, that are also in a big hunger for synthetic fuels, for their decarbonization. So these are the framework conditions that drives the demand for synthetic fuels, and we have to see how we're going to produce them. So we need what Leonida just presented before, so we need green hydrogen, and we need carbon. So green hydrogen, it's very much bound to renewable electricity. But carbon has to be looked at, which are the most appropriate carbon sources that we have that we can take for it. So this is the overall framework of the analysis, and then we have to see the characteristics of the demand that will largely come for the domestic demand from the available energy planning and policy requirements, for example, for the Renewable Energy Directive in Europe, or we have a market. So that would largely put the framework for the demand. Now let's look at the supply. To see the supply, we have first to identify the carbon point sources in South Africa, to understand the quantities that they can produce and how we can actually exploit them, to look at the sustainability, to understand the characteristics, the emission characteristics that these sectors would have also, and their evolution into the future. And that would be largely power, industry, and there is some potential for biomass, but we didn't touch very much on the biomass issue. So, taking the sectors one by one, the power sector that is based on coal has the potential to provide a lot of carbon. At the moment, coal in power generation dominates the mix, and also it is expected to still have quite a significant role into the future, despite the decarbonization efforts of the country, because we are going to have much higher demand into the future, because South Africa is developing and actually developing fast. But carbon will, the share of coal would be diminishing in favor of renewables, but still it will be quite significant because we have to cover a big demand, right? So we have both new and old power plants that are being renovated. So we have the fleet, and we know that it's going to be alive for years to come. The only available document that we have at the moment is the official document, is the IRP planning, where actually stress out the importance of coal. So by considering the official emissions of the power plants from coal, one can calculate an average emission factor to be used in order to make projections of how the emissions from the coal sector would evolve. And we have to do this in lack of any integrated energy planning work for the country. And now you can see here with the blue line the expected emissions from the sector. Of course, there are a lot of caveats that could be added in a picture like this. And to my understanding, to my view, numbers are not that much. The exact numbers is not the important point here, but just to see the trend and the methodology, if we can capture this right. So we have the blue line that would be the expected emissions of the sector into the future, and then you can apply a capture rate based on the state-of-the-art carbon capture technologies of up to, for example, 90% to see how much carbon potentially one could capture. Of course, the actual, this is a theoretical exercise, so the actual number could be much lower, probably lower up to 20 or 30% to the maximum theoretical red value, and this has to do with the specifics of the installation and the needs for electricity that a CCU unit on the coal fire plant would require. So this poses significant limitations. And actually, all this would take time, and one should look after 2030 how that technologies could be implemented in the power sector. Next, it's industry. So industry, it is important to look at the unavoidable emissions of industry. So we have to look at the process emissions, right? So we had quite a significant amount based on the latest official statistical data in South Africa. It's quite energy intense, and we do have three sectors, the petrochemicals, the iron and steel, and the cement industry that can actually, are eager, because they do have significant capabilities of incorporating CCU technologies in their processes. Now, still, in industrial sector, there is the big problem of having, we don't have at hand an holistic integrated planning to 2050, so as to be based on and see how the sector would look like in the future. So based on other available public sources, for example, the McKinsey recent work a couple of years ago of Africa Green Manufacturing Crossroads, one can understand based on the analysis that the McKinsey has done, or can estimate the evolution of the industrial sectors in South Africa into the future, considering scenarios for the evolution of the industrial sector in the entire Africa. So, by estimating some emission factors based also on the activity that one could expect to have in South Africa, we can estimate the and applying typical emission factors in these industries, we can estimate the emissions coming from the industrial sector under two scenarios, at least two scenarios. The one is the existing African NDC scenarios that assumes that we are going to stick into the NDC trajectories of the countries as we have now, and the other one would be with the global NDC ambitious scenario, meaning that countries intensify their decarbonization efforts in order to go closer to carbon neutrality towards 2050. So we can see now the emissions in each sector, the iron and steel, in the petrochemicals and coal-to-liquid industry, and in the minerals. So we have the emissions. Now we can estimate the emissions, and then now we have to apply the technology that would capture and utilize carbon in these emissions. We're going to do this in a second. Just to mention that another carbon source could be biomass. And here we could have biomass as a carbon carrier, and we could have BECCS, or bioenergy carbon capture and storage, or biogenic carbon that could be integrated into other conversion technologies and produce synthetic fuels. Now, in South Africa, there is a lot of great discussion about the carbon potential, and we do have the studies of the famous NBI work, where we have a considerable available biomass coming mostly from agricultural residues, municipal waste, and invasive alien species. So there is an indication about the biomass potential that could be also utilized to produce biogenic carbon. But at the same time, there are other sources, like the WWF study that has been done a few years ago on the sustainable aviation fuel, that suggest quite significant, a larger amount of biomass. And this has to do with the definition of what is considered waste and what is not. But this is a very important discussion. We're not talking about sustainability of carbon. If you want to put it on a Power-to-X project that would meet the sustainability requirements of your exporting markets. So in biomass, there is considerable, let's say, uncertainty in the determination of potential. And this study was not focused on actually deciphering on this on the situation on biomass, but rather looking at the industrial point sources of carbon. So, domestic demand. Domestic demand would come of the demand that the country would have for liquid fuels. So the NBI again had done an excellent work and had produced future outlooks until to 2050 under various scenarios of the fossil liquid fuels that would be needed to cover domestic needs in South Africa. So what we did, we combined the scenarios of the NBI report with the scenarios of the McKinsey for the decarbonization of industry, where we had the different ambitious levels, and we concluded and we assumed that, okay, let's gradually substitute fossil-based liquid fuels with sustainable Power-to-X fuels. So you can compute the the liters of synthetic fuels that you need, and with some reverse easy engineering, you can estimate how much carbon you need to achieve these quantities of fuels. So you can have an estimation of how much carbon is needed to cover the domestic demands in South Africa. So you have the estimation of the domestic demand through this approach. I'm not going to guide you through all these scenarios, but just to grab the idea. We have the domestic demand, okay, and then we can see how we can cover this demand. So we have mineral, petrochemical, iron, steel, and power sector as the main carbon sources. For the power sector, we can go and utilize carbon from flue gases as they are. For the industrial sectors, we have to to focus on the unavoidable emissions. So we have to look at the post-emissions. So one has to estimate how much from the total emissions from the industrial sector would actually refer to the process emissions. So by applying this typical process emission share, one can calculate the expected emissions of CO2 that could be captured from the industry into the future, also by applying a typical carbon capture and utilization technology on site. So we have the produced carbon through this approach, the domestic carbon demand through the approach that we just described before. So by subtracting those numbers, you can have an estimation about the carbon quantities that potentially could be available for exports. Of course, this picture has a great uncertainty. One has to look at the various ranges because you have a lot of unknown parameters. For example, it's very difficult to apply a constant percentage of carbon capture because at the end it is very much dependent on the specific site and the application that you have. And one needs to go and look into cases on a case basis to actually understand if you can capture 20% or 25% or 10% maybe of the carbon that is available in the flue gases of the industrial process or in the power plant. Having all these considerations and considering the scenarios, you can see that in a case where we include CO2 from the power sector that maybe we're allowed to do now, but for example, it will not be allowed in Europe after 2035, based on the recent CBAM regulation. It appears that we may have significant quantities of carbon to be exported. If you consider, however, if you exclude the power sector due to sustainability criteria that needs to be met, for example, in the European market, this potential drops significantly. And there are cases, depending on the scenario for the level of the domestic demand, that you don't have actually much carbon to export. So this is the type of the analysis that has to be done at a high level to understand the dynamics of the CO2, the quantities of CO2 to be exported, and how we can export CO2 either directly. I remind you the hype in CO2 carriers. So you can, if there was a regional market that you could supply CO2 to other countries that only have renewable power, so they combine it with hydrogen to produce Power-to-X, or Power-to-X products can be produced locally in South Africa, both to cover domestic demand and to be exported afterwards. Now, it seems that there is the potential, and considering the history of carbon capture and storage in South Africa, the previous, a couple of 2 decades, it was a hype then, it went again on hibernation, now it starts, the discussion is going to start again, but still, there are no explicit targets in the country for CCU or CCS. So if you don't have this, we've learned today, we've seen today, the commitment that there is at the political and higher level. But for those things to kick off that are specialized, you need also specific targets. And this is something, I think, an important message that has to pass in order to start the actual work. The good thing is that there is a variety of green fuels and Power-to-X products that could actually produce a nice portfolio of opportunities for additional revenues for the country, depending on the international market conditions. The second important issue is to understand the technologies and their feasibility. And this cannot be done unless one looks at specific case-on-a-case basis. For example, and then maybe we can also provoke the discussion afterwards, it is very important to look at the specific power plant, coal-fired power plant, to understand if we could apply a CCU unit there, and to see if we could apply this, how the profitability of the power plant would change, and how much carbon we could capture from the available carbon in flue gases. That would be, I would estimate, no more than 20 or 15% of the carbon in the flue gases. much less than the 90% of the theoretical upper limit that we discussed before. So a lot, I think, specific feasibility studies have to be made, and also we have to carefully look at the CCU and CCUS technology readiness in order to be able to see the costs and then to see if they can produce a bankable case. And finally, it is important to understand the dynamics of the export markets. And this very much has to do with the imposed sustainability criteria, because Europe might be the one, let's say, the market that comes out more loudly, but Europe also has the strictest sustainability criteria. So in the previous session, we have been discussing about maritime, and maritime is an excellent opportunity with looser, I would say, sustainability criteria. I hope no one from IMO is listening to us. So that would be a market, a first market to target, or maybe sustainable aviation fuels, where again, ICAO has also the possibility of the LCAF fuels, the lower carbon aviation fuels, that has requirements that much easier to meet in terms of carbon intensity of the final product. So export markets, again, should be considered if there is, if any pilot project is about to be made, let's say, to kickstart this process. And I think I talked too much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, George. Can I open up the floor for any questions? I'll start here.
Hi, my name is Ali from Egypt. First, thank you for this exciting presentation and information. I have several questions, but I will try to make it short. First one, do you expect that CCS will play a role in decarbonization in South Africa? Second one, in last slide, you said that several studies have been done or ongoing to assess geological storage in South Africa. Do you have preliminary findings about this? Does South Africa have caverns or something suitable for carbon storage? Last one, you talked about, for example, 20% of carbon capture. That's when you are using post-combustion carbon capture. Did you consider, for example, pre-combustion, oxy-fuel, or other technology for carbon capture, which can give you higher rates of carbon capture? And thank you. That's it.
Perfect. So I will start from the second question. Okay. Actually, I was referring to studies that have already been published during the previous 10 or 15 years or so, where there was a hype, if I may call, for CCS in South Africa, to see if there are aquifers, if there is a geological formation where you can store carbon. I think after that time, the whole discussion went down, and now it starts again. So I'm not aware of current studies looking at this. I know that a pilot has been funded by from the World Bank to look at storage, carbon storage, and I think that this actually started the implementation this year. I cannot really recall. But other than that, I'm not aware of other studies, and I'm not doing any other study on this. Now, the third question that I remember now is that, yes, we look at the post-combustion carbon capture. Why we did this? Because we assumed that one is going to implement this in an existing power plant. And why we did this? Because we look at the IRP and the ESCOM plan for renewing its fleet, and there are no any evidence that a new power plant could be designed from the day zero to being an oxy-fuel power plant. So actually, would it make sense? I mean, you cannot. In an existing power plant, you cannot. You can only apply the post-combustion capturing. So that's why we consider only this and this option. And the 20% that I'm saying to you comes from actual calculations that we have made, that was not shown here, that suggests that actually the limiting factor is the electricity that you need to run the CCU, the electricity that you need to run the electrolyzer to produce renewable hydrogen, that could be combined with the carbon that you produced from the CCU unit to make the synthetic fuels. So the case would look like you have the CCU on the power plant with an electrolyzer and I don't know, solar, wind, whatever, nearby to locally produce, for example, synthetic methanol. So, and because of the, actually the electricity that you need, it limits how much carbon can you capture, because it doesn't make any sense to import electricity for the needs of the locally produced synthetic fuels. So this is a significant limiting factor that has to be looked if there are any application. And the first question was?
Do you think that CCS will play a major role in decarbonization future of South Africa?
I don't know. I think that there is potential, mainly because of the carbon intensity of the country. The experience from decarbonization studies in other countries, in other part of the world, suggests that CCS is important for the last mile in the power generation, not actually to reduce the emissions of the power sector, but to create negative emissions through the application of bioenergy and CCS, because you need to compensate the emissions that you cannot actually remove in industry. So this is a role for the CCU and S towards 2050 decarbonization. But you know better than me that at the moment we lack in South Africa an holistic energy planning study that would see all sectors together and understand the dynamics of one another and see where carbon capture could be made. However, I know I have seen the plans of ArcelorMittal, and I'm pretty sure that, and Sasol as well, and I'm pretty sure that they know what they're doing. So if they have in their plans to do CCUS in South Africa, then there should be future for it.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think there was a hand here and then side.
Hello, Ibrahim Takolia from Green Hydrogen Solutions. I'm also doing work with the CSIR and GFA and the PTX Hub. So just a question, we focus a lot on techno-economics. So if you're going to use the carbon, for a model to make sense, you're going to have 3 to 5 years of capital investment and then about 20 years of operation. So one of the challenges is, if you look at the coal-fired plants, they're going to extend the life a little bit longer, but you're going to have quite a drop-off in terms of carbon. And then, so now if you build the infrastructure to use the free carbon, which then does not become free at some stage, you might have to supplement that with direct air capture. It's very difficult to see unless you have an absolute guarantee that you're going to have carbon for free for 20 years, that the economics would make sense. So just a comment on that.
No, I totally agree. At the moment, it appears that we do have for the power sector until 2035, that is the cutoff date of CBAM, and then for industry until 2041. I haven't done the exercise to see if the economics work until that period. I'm pretty sure that it would be tough. But it's also a matter of policy and market to determine if the premium will be there. We have been discussing before, and the first thing that in the previous session that was mentioned was that, okay, the IMO has the strategy of the decarbonization, and the discussion is that this is going to, the lever would be also the carbon price for shipping. So if you have, at some point, the price of carbon could actually, could make probably the economics to work around simply because there will be no other solution. But I agree with the current market conditions, it seems tough.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure if I want to add something, but first of all, thanks for the comment from your side. My name is Felix. I'm working for a trading house in Hamburg, and we are ramping up a project for exporting e-fuels for bunkering, but also for export. And to make it bankable in combination with rules and regulations, the bank asking for CO2 sources for over 20 years. And if you start now the production, if you start now the project, 3 years of capex, and then you run the project, they want their source. So we are running under RED 3, which forbid unavoidable, or you are allowed to use unavoidable until 2041. If you use non-unavoidable, you are ending up at 2036. So you have an issue and might have to think about importing CO2 from biofuels, CO2 from biomass, sorry, for producing biomethanol. So I'm quite surprised, but at the same time curious about, if you mentioned, to export CO2 out of South Africa. So there's a little bit of link or difficulty of the bankability, I would say.
Definitely, that's why.
So not a question, but
no, it's a very fair and valid comment. Actually, this is why we, from the very beginning, we extended the framework not to EU but to the international markets, because with the current, let's say, LCA processes that regulation in Europe has, it's very difficult to achieve the 70% reduction in carbon intensity of the final fuel with carbon source like this. The good thing in South Africa is that there is an untapped potential on biomass. So if you look at the invasive alien species that there is available in the country, that would actually provide significant amount of carbon after, let's say, the initial 10 years period. Of course, it's a question of if the economics work out. Huh?
And also, again, sorry,
yeah, please.
Also a question of sustainability, because ultimately you would like to eradicate.
Yeah.
So my name is Henrik from GFA. I was also part of the process of the other thing that Luanita presented. No, I'm just wanted to make the comment, because if you look at bush encroachment, for instance, like in Namibia, which would also be an option for South Africa, then the question is whether this would also be sustainable ultimately.
Yes, definitely.
Because you aim to eradicate and not to produce again and again, to have a sustainable source. And this leaves us ultimately only with biomass plants here in South Africa as a source at one point.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, are there any more questions? I think we have time to take one more question.
I've read somewhere that there's technology that enables the capturing of carbon from seawater that could potentially be coupled with the desalination plant linked to hydrogen production. Is that actually a thing? Do you have any thoughts or comments on that?
There is. You can use algae and then see. You can also use algae and then algae biomass to provide the carbon. But we haven't looked at this. In South Africa, I think that there are a couple of cases where they look on how algae could be produced where the clean municipal wastewater, and then see the potential of using that biomass for carbon source. But this is a small pilot study. I think it is where the PetroSA is located. But I cannot recall, on top of my head, if further information on this.
I would say it's a matter of quantity, because if you want to produce 500,000 metric tons of e-fuels, you need 700,000 metric tons of CO2. That's one cement industry. So to really find this kind of biomass, to export it, to scale it up, a hydrogen project, it's difficult. You have to find a lot of biomass.
Thank you so much. I don't know if there is a short question, but we do have maybe time to take one more question. Otherwise, we can close the session. Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much. My name is Deones. I am also part of GFA. I just wanted to build on what she asked about the carbon source from the seawater, not from algae. So the seawater, from what the paper says, that the seawater has 3 times more CO2 than air. The question is, from your experience, will it be eligible, this CO2, if we can, you are doing the desalination, or then you get immediately water you need and CO2? Is it this one we can consider during all the project planning? That's the question. Thank you.
I have to be very open and honest with you. I don't know. I have to look at the RED III regulation that I think it's very open to interpretation to see if that source of carbon would be eligible. I'm not aware of any discussion, at least at the RED III level, that would allow this, but it may be the case that this has skipped from everyone. I mean, we have to look at it. I really don't know.
Thank you so much, everybody, for joining today's session. Please, can I just make a quick announcement? If you want to stay up to date and find out information about events or anything happening within H2SA, Green Hydrogen South Africa, and the International PTX Hub, please feel free to scan the QR codes there to join our LinkedIn group pages. I also just want to take a minute to thank Luanita and George as well for taking the time to participate in this session. They will both be around should you have any other questions that may come up or want to continue the conversation further. Thank you.